When people talk about the Fry's model of consent, they often overlook the incoherence of it, which immediately distorts the entire conversation. At first glance, it seems like a good model, but that assumption breaks down once you actually examine its flaws. The real issue isn't the concept itself, but rather the intentions behind it, especially when you consider the complexity of the acronym. This is why radically woke leftists should rethink how they interpret consent, because the implications extend far beyond the baseline assumptions people will have of it. Before diving deeper, it's important to separate consent in a general sense from consent in a specific sense, and recognize how one's personal and momentary impulse shapes the entire discussion moving forward into the analysis ahead. A claim they make is that the F in the Fry's model is that consent must be freely given, assuming anyone can ever truly freely consent, but that assumption collapses because of men socially conditioned to give what I'd call aggressive consent and women, passive consent. In practice, this means a man, socially conditioned to always want sex, should never turn down a seductive woman. For example, a woman wants a particular man, so she wears heavier makeup and scantier attire to tempt him into courting her to sleep with her, which he does. When examined further, the model relies on freedom being absolute with every person with no external interference, which is usually not demonstrated. This creates a problem when the man is seen as the perpetrator rather than the victim. If applied consistently, it would also imply that women trying to reel in men in a seemingly passive way would be rapists. A clearer interpretation is that freely is not clearly defined in this model, which confronts the issue. Therefore, the original argument does not hold under its own standards. In short, the freely given part of the model is flawed. Another claim they make is that the R in the Fry's model is that consent must be reversible, assuming that most women reverse consent during intercourse, but that assumption breaks down because most of these women suffer post-coital regret. In practice, this means if a woman feels regret afterward, her consent prior was not sincere, thus she becomes a survivor. For example, both are intoxicated, but only the woman feels regret when she sobers up while the man feels satisfaction. When examined further, the model relies on consent being completely reversible, which is not actually demonstrated. This creates a problem because most accusations come from this scenario. If applied consistently, it would also imply that post-coital regret means the accused men are guilty. A clearer interpretation is that reversible is not clearly defined in this model, which confronts the issue. Therefore, the original argument does not hold under its own standards. In short, the reversible part of this model is flawed. A third claim they make is that consent must be informed, assuming you can ever be truly informed as if you can ever know all the jots and tittles or nooks and crannies of a person, but that assumption breaks down because many women lie about being on birth control so men will consent. In practice, this means the man was raped. For example, this is an extremely common situation where men are raped and robbed for up to 18 years. When examined further, the model relies on the woman being the victim, which is not actually demonstrated. This creates a problem because lying about birth control is more common than the examples given by feminists to charge the men. If applied consistently, it would also imply women are perpetrators. A clearer interpretation is that informed consent will always fail due to a technicality, which confronts the issue. Therefore, the original argument does not hold under its own standards. In short, informed consent isn't real. A fourth claim they make is that consent must be enthusiastic, assuming enthusiasm cannot be conditioned in some way, but that assumption breaks down because enthusiasm is often socially conditioned. In practice, this means men are conditioned to want to be husbands and fathers, and women, wives and mothers. For example, little girls raised to play with dolls and toy kitchens while boys are raised to play with action figures and construction toys. When examined further, the model relies on girls conditioned to be enthusiastic about becoming wives and mothers, and men, enthusiastic about being husbands and fathers, which is actually demonstrated. This creates an issue with marriage as a violation of consent on the grounds of enthusiasm. If applied consistently, it would also imply the bride and groom are equal victims. A clearer interpretation is that enthusiasm can be conditioned by social influences, which confronts the issue. Therefore, the original argument does not hold under its own standards. In short, enthusiastic consent is flawed. A fifth claim they make is that consent must be specific, assuming that every step of intimacy must be discussed and approved expressly, but that assumption collapses because it is literally a mood killer. In practice, this means every step of intimacy should have proof of consent such as written and signed agreements. For example, if a guy consents to a girl nibbling on his earlobe, but not sticking her tongue in his ear. When examined further, the model relies on step-by-step consent, which is not actually demonstrated. This creates a situation where you must always question the accuser. If applied consistently, it would imply that consent is never specific enough. A clearer interpretation is non-specific consent just blasts the door along with the whole wall for false accusations clean off, which demonstrates the issue. Therefore, the original argument does not hold under its own standards. In short, it enables false accusations. To conclude, the claim that the Fry's model of consent is valid does not hold under its own scrutiny. When we look at each point, it becomes clear that consent is extremely rigid while rape becomes extremely broad. Additionally, every accusation becomes technically true, further demonstrating that this is about danger more than safety. Even if one argues this is about protecting people from being accused, the evidence from false accusations and conviction rates shows there is a direct causal link. Overall, the most reasonable interpretation is that the model accuses more men, because statistics show accusations of rape rather than incidents have increased. This matters because more men are wrongfully convicted than guilty men exonerated. In short, that seems to be the point, and any fair assessment of the model must account for the disparity. Therefore, the strongest position remains that the model does more harm than good, not because it is convenient, but because it aligns with false conviction rates and false exoneration rates. That is the conclusion drawn from the full analysis above. Any contrary view requires stronger evidence.